Sorry, Mom. Mother-in-law comes first. That's what my son shouted as he boarded a cruise ship without me. I stood at the terminal with my suitcase, watching. When I turned to leave, a hand touched my shoulder. And that's when everything changed. In the end, I only had one thing to say to my son. Thank you for boarding that cruise without me. My name is Diane. I'm 63 years old, and it was at that boarding terminal that I understood my son could leave me behind with the same ease with which you forget an umbrella on a day it stopped raining. Without warning, without ceremony, without once looking back. Let me tell you how it all started, because it didn't start at that terminal. It started on an ordinary weekday afternoon, with a phone call I answered happily. I was at home when my cell phone rang. It was my son, Gregory. 30 years old, tall, with that hurried way he always had. Even as a boy, he'd get up from the table before finishing his food, always rushing toward the next place, as if wherever he was, never stayed good enough for long enough. I answered, and he immediately said he had bought 3 tickets for a cruise, departing from Miami, destination Nassau. He said he'd originally bought them for his mother-in-law, Donna Angela, but she had backed out at the last minute. And then he invited me. He told me the time, told me the terminal. And then he added something that touched me more than he imagined. It's the same place as always, Mom, where we went with Dad. I stayed silent for a second, phone to my ear, the apartment quiet around me. Then I said yes, that I'd love to. I said it before I even thought it through. It was the kind of answer that comes before the thought, because the feeling arrives first. Before hanging up, he asked me to go to the red boarding gate and wait for them there. I repeated it out loud to confirm. That habit I learned from Henry, who always said that saying things out loud was what separated confusion from clarity. I wrote it down on a piece of paper from the kitchen drawer. I hung up feeling content. I've been a widow for 5 years since Henry left me. I still haven't fully gotten used to the apartment without the sound of the television on, in the bedroom in the middle of the night. He slept with it on, volume low, that late-night news program I used to hate, and that now, sometimes, I leave running just because the silence gets too heavy without him. His coffee was always too strong for me, but I made it his way because he thanked me every morning as if I'd done something extraordinary. It wasn't the coffee he was thanking me for. It was that I was there. When Gregory said, "Where we went with Dad," I remembered a cruise the 3 of us took together when Gregory was around 12. Henry was so excited he bought a sailor's hat from the ship's store and wore it the entire time, even with the boy dying of embarrassment beside him. People would pass us in the corridor, and Gregory would turn his face the other way, and Henry would pretend not to notice and kept the hat tilted as if it were the official costume of that trip. That image settled into a special place in my memory. Not for the destination, not for the itinerary, not for the menu. For the laughter on the deck, the wind, the 3 of us together. The desire to go was real. It was concrete. It was mine. The next day, I went shopping. I bought sunscreen, the high SPF kind, because my face doesn't tolerate strong sun the way it did when I was 40. And a new pair of sunglasses with a brown frame that the woman at the optician's said looked wonderful. And I also bought a second pair of sunglasses for Gregory, the basic but good quality kind, because he always forgets his on every trip and spends the whole ride craning his neck to avoid looking straight into the sun. I also bought a new suitcase. My old one was still fine, but it was old in the sense that it scratched and had a zipper that jammed on the 3rd try. I thought, I take care of myself with what I have. I worked my whole life. Henry and I built what we have with a great deal of effort and choice. A new suitcase isn't a luxury. It's self-care. I bought it without guilt. On the morning before the trip, I woke up before my alarm, the way you do when something good is ahead. I had my coffee, strong the way Henry liked it, because I still make it that way out of habit, and started packing with the kind of care I put into things that matter to me. I laid the clothes in one by one, folded neatly, put the documents in a clear plastic folder Henry had bought once for when we travel a lot more, and set aside the elegant dress, the navy blue one, lightweight fabric with a modest neckline that works well in a ship's restaurant without being too much. While folding the dress, I remembered a night on a cruise with Henry. He had asked me to dance on the deck after dinner, at that hour when the orchestra plays slower and the ocean is dark on the other side of the railing. His jacket was crooked because the ship's rocking wasn't cooperating. His shoes were too big for that floor, and when he tried to spin me, he lost his balance and made me laugh until it hurt. The kind of laughter that comes from deep in your chest and can't be reproduced artificially. Henry was like that. He wasn't perfect in form, but he was perfect in intention. He always knew what he wanted to do, even when he got the execution wrong. I tucked Gregory's sunglasses into a side pocket of the suitcase, wrapped in the tissue paper from the store. I thought, when he sees them, he'll laugh and say I didn't have to. But I bought them anyway. That's the kind of love you can't explain to an adult child, the kind that buys the sunglasses even knowing you'll get a look that says, "Mom, you didn't need to get me anything." After finishing the packing, I called Gregory. I wanted to talk about the trip, find out if there was a special restaurant on board he'd already looked into, whether there was a show on the ship worth reserving in advance. He answered in a rush, said he was in a meeting, that he'd call back later. That's fine. Those things happen. Adult life has a rhythm that doesn't ask permission. The afternoon passed. I made a simple lunch, put some clothes in the wash, went to check if I'd forgotten anything from the packing list. Evening came, and I sat on the sofa waiting for Gregory's call, phone on the side table, the way you do when you're waiting for something you know is coming. But he didn't call. I tried again. Once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. I tried Lauren, my daughter-in-law. Voicemail too. I found it strange, but I didn't want to create a story in my head. I thought, they must be busy. They must have gone somewhere. Tomorrow we'll meet at the terminal and talk. I scheduled an Uber to Miami for the next morning, sent Gregory a WhatsApp message letting him know what time I'd be leaving. He was offline. The message sat with a single checkmark for hours. I went to sleep with the new suitcase ready beside the bed, the navy blue dress folded on top. I lay down thinking he'd call in the middle of the night, explaining some last-minute change. He didn't call. I woke up before my alarm. I checked my phone. Gregory was still offline. The messages still had the single checkmark. No response, no confirmation. I called twice. Voicemail. The apartment was quiet, the morning light still faint through the living room window. I got up, made coffee, drank it standing at the kitchen counter the way I do when my mind is busy. It wasn't quite worry. It was a kind of discomfort I couldn't name, that was there, but that I kept not wanting to hear. The Uber arrived on time. I got in with the new suitcase and the driver asked if I was going on a cruise. I said yes, that I was going to meet my son. He said the terminal was busy that weekend. I traveled the whole length of I-95, looking out the window, the city giving way to the causeway, the water on both sides, that stretch of road I know by heart from decades of trips, with Henry, with little Gregory, sometimes alone. I remembered how many times Gregory pressed his face against the car window on the right side, waiting for the exact moment the ocean appeared below. He had a name for that moment. I can't remember what it was anymore. But I remember the look on his face when the ocean appeared. When I arrived at the terminal, it was busy. I dragged the suitcase across the smooth floor of the hall, passing whole families with mountains of luggage accumulated over years, children running between the legs of adults, couples with cameras around their necks choosing the first angle of the trip. I went in and headed straight for the red boarding gate, the exact place Gregory had asked me to wait. I positioned myself at a spot with a good view of the main entrance. I stood with my suitcase beside me, like a companion, and began to wait. The terminal had a specific smell at that hour of the morning. Old air conditioning mixed with coffee shop coffee and fresh sunscreen from people who had just gotten ready for the sun. There was something festive in the air, that collective energy of people about to leave for somewhere good. I took out my phone and tried to call one more time. Voicemail. I looked at the clock on my phone, then at the large clock hanging on the terminal wall, as if the two would give me different answers. The right time was passing, and I was in the right place, exactly where I'd been asked to be, with the new suitcase beside me and the tissue-wrapped sunglasses in the side pocket. I found the delay odd, but I stayed. That's the kind of thing I do. I stay in the agreed-upon place because I believe in commitment, because I was raised that way and raised my son that way, or at least I believed I had. While I waited, my hand went to the side pocket of the suitcase and touched, through the fabric, the small shape of the tissue paper. The sunglasses I'd bought thinking of Gregory. And then I looked up, and I saw, on the other side of the terminal, moving through the corridor that led to another gate, not the red one, another one, my son. Lauren, Donna Angela, bags in hand, steady pace, already in the process of boarding like people who know exactly where they're going. Donna Angela, with the beige suitcase I recognized from a distance because it has a red bow on the handle that she put there herself to identify it. Lauren in dark sunglasses, that firm stride of hers. Gregory with the old college backpack he insists on taking on every trip because he says it's the best one he's ever had. The three of them walking together without hurry, like people who are exactly where they plan to be. Like people who knew from the beginning how that day was going to go. Gregory saw me. I know the exact moment because he quickened his pace, raised one hand in a kind of vague gesture, half goodbye, half an apology that never quite became one, and shouted from a distance, barely breaking his stride, "Sorry, Mom, mother-in-law comes first," and went in laughing. The laughter was still in the corridor when the boarding door closed. Lauren didn't turn her face. Donna Angela didn't either. I stood still. The people around me kept doing what they were doing, because for them, nothing had happened. The terminal stayed busy, the children kept running, the couples kept looking for angles. For me, the sound had suddenly wilted, like when you step out of a noisy room into a closed corridor and only then realize the noise you'd been tolerating. My hands were cold. I noticed when I closed one of them around the handle of the suitcase. The air conditioning hit the back of my neck with that dry cold of an enclosed space. My mind was already calculating the very ordinary things, the Uber back, the drive up I-95, who was going to unfold the clothes in the new suitcase, what to do with the sunglasses I'd bought wrapped in tissue paper from a store that had taken the trouble to wrap them with care. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from Gregory. Short. "Sorry, Mom. We forgot to tell you. Head home. We'll talk later." I read it. Read it again. There was a specific kind of pain in the lightness of those words. He had typed them the way you send a pharmacy reminder, the way you clear a loose end before getting back to the day's agenda. I didn't react. On the outside, at least. On the inside, it was something else. But this wasn't the moment to let that something else show in the middle of a terminal full of people with somewhere to go. I put the phone in my coat pocket. I took hold of the suitcase handle, and I started walking toward the exit. 3 steps. 4. The calculations running. The Uber, the drive back, the blue dress that was going to be unfolded and put away before its time. 5 steps. 6. That's when a hand touched my shoulder. But before I go on, I know there are people listening to me right now who have felt something like this, from inside their house, inside their car, inside a life that sometimes feels like everyone made plans without telling you. Write in the comments where you're from. Sometimes we think we're alone in these things. We're not. Continuing, I turned around slowly, without rushing. An elegant woman in front of me, a carry-on bag beside her, a VIP badge hanging around her neck in a color you could spot from a distance, a blouse in a neutral fabric you recognize from afar by its quality. Short hair, very well kept, and that smile that goes from ear to ear and never changes with time, never changes with the situation. Always the same smile with the same genuine width. It took me a second. It had been many years since we'd seen each other in person. But the smile hadn't changed, so the recognition came inevitably. Christina. Christina and I met at a travel industry conference many years ago. when I still worked in corporate events, and she was building what would go on to become one of the most successful private travel agencies on the East Coast. We sat by accident at the same lunch table. She was alone, I was alone. The buffet was running late, and the conversation started almost naturally, the way conversations start that are going to last. She had a way of listening that was rare in that environment of people who were always wanting to talk about themselves. When I spoke, she kept her eyes completely on me. She didn't look at her phone. She didn't search for someone more interesting over my shoulder. She didn't finish my sentences to speed things along. We kept talking until the room staff started collecting the chairs. When we left, she said, "I'll call you this week." And she did, on Tuesday, as she'd promised. Over the years, life separated our schedules the way it does with everyone. Her with the agency growing, constant travel, projects that don't sleep. Me with Gregory growing up, with Henry, with the reorganizations life imposes without asking. We see each other less than we should, and more than our schedules would allow. And every time we meet, it's as if the gap in between never really existed. There are people like that, who you can run into after 3 years and pick up at the exact sentence where you left off. What I didn't know was that she would be at that terminal that morning, at that specific moment, heading for exactly that ship. There, she looked at me with that smile of hers and asked excitedly what I was doing standing there, why I hadn't boarded yet. It was almost time. There was an energy about her that was always hard to resist, the kind of person who walks into a room and the room shifts slightly in temperature as if one more element had adjusted into place. I told her everything right there, standing in the terminal, with the suitcase between us and the flow of people passing on all sides. She listened without interrupting me once. Let me go all the way to the end with every detail, including the ones I hadn't realized I was carrying with such weight. The tissue paper with the sunglasses in the side pocket, the folded dress inside the suitcase, the unanswered messages, the single check mark on WhatsApp. When I finished, she made that brief pause of hers, the one of someone weighing what to say not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the weight of what they heard. And then she said, with a clarity that left no room for objection, "I'm sorry, Diane, but your son is an idiot." A pause. "You didn't board with him, but you're boarding with me. Today, you're my guest." It wasn't a question. It was a declaration, as if it were already settled fact, and she was simply informing me as a courtesy. I thought she was offering me company. Just company. Someone beside me, so the trip wouldn't be a complete absence. I had no idea what was coming next. I boarded alongside Christina, and it was there, already on the boarding gangway, that I saw the ship up close for the first time with real attention. It was impressive, not in the way that impresses through ostentation, but in the way that impresses through scale. White, enormous, with those modern lines that seemed to have no beginning or end, as if it continued beyond what the eyes could follow. I stopped for a moment, hand on the suitcase handle, just looking at it. For that second, I literally forgot everything that had happened in the last hour. The gate, the words, the cold phone in my hand. The ship knew nothing of any of it. Christina laughed at my amazement and said, "Come on, Diane, there's still so much to see." There was genuine pleasure in the way she said it. The pleasure of someone about to reveal something to someone who doesn't yet know what they're about to see. As soon as we came on board, I noticed the crew seemed to know Christina by heart. Every person we crossed, stewards, receptionists, officers in white uniforms with rank insignia, greeted her by name with the familiarity of people who have spent many seasons together, shared itineraries, and perhaps weathered storms at sea. She greeted everyone with the same smile, asked after people, remembered details from previous trips. It wasn't performance. It was who she was, genuinely. And she introduced me to everyone. "This is my friend Diane, my special guest." That special guest, repeated with each introduction, was adjusting something inside me that I hadn't even realized was out of place. Something in my shoulders, in my posture, a weight I had been carrying since the red gate, without noticing the weight. The captain, when he spotted us in the main corridor, came toward us with the kind of smile a person carries on their face, rather than puts on for the occasion. Mid-50s, well-kept silver hair, uniform with the details that mark rank, but mainly a presence of someone accustomed to organizing a room simply by entering it, without needing volume. Christina then gently took my arm and said, "Captain, this is my dear friend Diane. We've known each other for decades. I won't say how many," and laughed. The captain greeted me by name with a warmth that didn't feel like learned protocol. It was temperament, that quality of a person who genuinely likes people and lets it show. Then Christina led me to the suite. We went up one floor higher than expected. The corridor became quieter, more spacious, with a thicker carpet that muffled the sound of footsteps in a way that organized the atmosphere even before the door opened. When she opened it, I stood in the doorway for a moment. It wasn't a room. It was an apartment inside the ship. A separate sitting area with a sofa and coffee table, a bedroom with a king-size bed that occupied the central space with a quiet authority, a marble bathroom with indirect lighting. And the private balcony, a real balcony, with 2 chairs and a small table, and the ocean opening completely out there, with nothing between me and the Atlantic. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around without quite knowing what to say. The air had that smell of newness, fresh towels, quality soap, a space no one had occupied before me. Christina said simply, "Make yourself at home. You deserve this," and left to give me space to settle in. I settled in slowly. I opened the balcony door and stood there a long time, hands on the cold metal of the railing, looking at the ocean. Miami was growing small in the distance, the buildings becoming tips, the city's contours dissolving into the background blue. The ship advanced with that quiet steadiness of something large that doesn't need to hurry to prove anything. There was something in that which I couldn't fully name. It wasn't joy. It was too early for joy. It was more that feeling of when you stop holding something you'd been holding without realizing. Your shoulders come down a little. Your jaw loosens. Your breathing normalizes without you giving it any instruction. Shortly after, Christina returned and said with that tone that leaves no margin, "Get ready. We're going to the spa soon." I was about to say I didn't need to, that I could rest in the suite, that I didn't want to be any trouble. But she was already choosing which of the towels were the best ones, so I went. The spa was another dimension inside the ship, quiet, with that soft, honey-colored light that seems to suspend time, a scent I can't quite name, but that's a mixture of something eucalyptus and something floral. We spent hours there, in silence when silence was called for, talking when there was something to say. She told me about recent trips, about a client who nearly lost their passport in London, and a currency mix-up in Japan that ended with a complimentary dinner at the best restaurant in the city. I laughed at things I didn't know still made me laugh that way that comes from the stomach, not just the mouth. It was there that it struck me suddenly, in the middle of that warm silence, to think about how many people must exist going through versions of this in silence. Receiving a "sorry" in a text message, folding back the dress they'd set aside with such care, calling the Uber back home, with no hand touching their shoulder at the right moment, with no sweet door opening on the unexpected side, and how rare it is to find someone like that, who appears at exactly the right moment when you're about to walk out the wrong door. For a long moment, I forgot completely about the red boarding gate. I forgot the message, forgot the coldness of, "We forgot to tell you." I forgot the tissue-wrapped sunglasses. I forgot everything. Until, late in the afternoon, as we were heading back to the suite, I picked up my phone and saw the notification. It was a post from Gregory on social media. A photo. Him smiling, Lauren on one side, Donna Angela on the other, the ocean behind them. The caption said something about making the most of every moment. The likes were already past 200. I looked at that photo longer than I expected to. It wasn't anger. Anger is in a hurry, and what I felt was slower than that. It was a weight that settled gradually, that I recognized, that I had felt before in different situations, but that had never come specifically from Gregory. It had never been him looking at me and not looking. It had never been the face of someone clearing a loose end and moving on. I thought about the boy who used to press his face against the car window on I-95 waiting for the ocean to appear. About the teenager who would bring his friends home and introduce them with that half-embarrassed pride of someone still discovering they have pride. About the man who had said, "Where we went with Dad," in a phone call 2 days ago, like someone who knew exactly where that sentence would reach me. And then there on the screen, smiling with his mother-in-law and his wife, the ocean behind them, and 200 likes on a caption about making the most of every moment. I asked Christina to take a photo of me there, in the suite, with the balcony and the ocean behind me. She took the phone with the careful seriousness of someone who wants it to come out genuinely well. She asked me to stand with my hands slightly relaxed, changed the angle twice, showed me the 3 options side by side. I chose the middle one. The middle one is always the best. I discovered that over the years without being able to explain why. I posted it. No caption, no text, just the photo. Me, the suite, the navy blue dress that had traveled toward one story and found a completely different one, the ocean behind me, as if it had always been mine. In less than 2 minutes, a message appeared on the screen. "Mom, are you on board?" I didn't respond. I put the phone face down on the side table in the suite's sitting area and went to the balcony. The sun was beginning to lower, that shift in color that happens when the light turns more golden and the ocean receives it and gives it back differently, deeper, quieter, more itself. Christina came up behind me with 2 glasses of sparkling water and stood beside me, looking at the same ocean. She asked, without looking at me, just looking ahead, "Did he see it?" I said yes. The 2 of us were silent for a moment, a silence that didn't need to be filled, that existed completely on its own. Then we laughed. I can't quite explain what that laughter was. It wasn't satisfaction in the small sense. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't victory. It was that thing when life has its own sense of humor and doesn't ask permission to use it. It was the laughter of when a situation is genuinely, absurdly ironic, and to deny it would be more dishonest than to acknowledge it. Another message appeared. "Mom, how do you know the captain?" I didn't respond to that one either. I went to get ready for dinner. In that time between the photo and dinner, while the ship moved toward the more open Atlantic, I found myself thinking about Gregory. Not with resentment. It was never my nature to carry that kind of weight for long. But thinking in the sense of trying to understand what goes through the mind of an adult son who does what he did that morning. Gregory was always a boy who needed to please everyone at once. Not in a servile way, but in that specific way of someone with a genuine fear of open conflict who finds roundabout exits to avoid it. In school, he stayed in the middle of every group because having to choose a side made him uncomfortable. In adult life, that became a kind of impossible balancing act between 2 worlds, his family and Lauren's. Donna Angela held a different kind of weight in that relationship. I don't need to know her deeply to see that. I just need to know my son. She had the kind of presence that creates obligation without asking permission, that way of needing that becomes imperative without explicit declaration, without negotiation, without anyone having said anything. I'm not saying she's a bad person. I don't have enough data for that, and I wouldn't be honest if I said so. But I know that when Gregory is between 2 sides and doesn't want to choose, he always chooses whichever one will create less friction the next day. That morning in Miami, the path of least friction was to shout sorry and go in laughing. Not because he didn't care. I think he did care. In his way, which is a way I need to learn to understand, even when it hurts. But because calculating the cost of warning me beforehand was more complicated than dealing with it afterward, or not even dealing with it, just letting time pass. That didn't make what he did any less wrong. It just made it more understandable. And sometimes those are the hardest things to deal with, not the cruelties of those who don't love you, but the negligence of those who love you and get lost along the way without realizing how much they're losing. That evening, Christina said without room for negotiation, "Diane, put on your best outfit. Tonight, we're dining with the captain." I stopped for a second, processing that. I imagined myself there, on a cruise that size, dining at the captain's table. It seemed like too much for someone who had arrived at the terminal in an Uber with a new suitcase and an invitation that had never really been hers. But I went. I put on the navy blue dress, the same one I had set aside so carefully the morning before, the same one I had folded thinking of my son, imagining the restaurants on board he might have looked up. That dress had traveled toward one story and found a completely different one. I stopped in front of the marble bathroom mirror for a moment, not with vanity, but with a different kind of recognition. I was 63 years old, on a ship I hadn't planned for, in the dress I had planned for another occasion, and I was all right. Not perfectly resolved, but whole, present. I took a deep breath. I walked out. We were escorted by one of the officers to an elegant mezzanine above the main dining room. It was a smaller space than the main hall, more private, fewer tables, an indirect light that made everything more beautiful without forcing it. The captain was waiting for us standing beside the set table, with that warmth that didn't feel like performance from someone fulfilling protocol. He greeted us by name, pulled out the chairs, and conversation began with the naturalness of someone accustomed to creating an atmosphere, not merely occupying one. He spoke of voyages not as itineraries, but as lived experiences, how the sky over the South Atlantic is different from the Mediterranean, how the behavior of the ocean changes with latitude in a way you learn to read, but never learn completely. Christina added stories from the agency, about clients who had discovered callings in ports they hadn't planned to know. I listened, spoke when I had something to say, and noticed that I was present in a way I couldn't remember the last time I'd been. Present as a whole person, not as a mother, not as a widow, not as someone who had been left at a terminal with her suitcase and a sorry shouted from a distance as if that were enough. But before we sat at the table, before, as we walked through the corridor toward the mezzanine, my heels echoing on the floor with a regularity I concentrated on keeping, I was certain I heard below, in the main dining room, a voice I knew by heart. A voice I had learned to recognize before that son even had words. When it was only a baby's cry, when it was the shout of a boy falling, when it was a voice breaking in adolescence without warning. "Mom! Mom!" With that urgency of someone not accustomed to going unanswered. I didn't stop. I didn't look down. I kept my pace, my shoulders in place, my hand lightly resting on the corridor railing. I kept walking as if I hadn't heard anything, not because I hadn't, but because there was a part of me that needed that moment. Not as punishment for him, as proof for myself that I could keep moving forward without turning around every time my name was called with urgency. I sat down at the table. When I discreetly checked my phone, there were several missed calls and a new message. "Mom, what are you doing on the ship? How do you know the captain?" I read it. I smiled subtly to myself, not for him, because he couldn't see me. I put the phone in my bag, and I didn't respond. Dinner was extraordinarily pleasant. The food was impeccable. The conversation flowed with the ease of conversations that don't need to work in order to exist. And the ocean outside, visible through the corridor windows below, was calm in that way the ocean has when it decides not to be the protagonist of the evening. At some point between the main course and dessert, I noticed that my shoulders were loose, my hands relaxed on the white tablecloth, and a lightness in my chest that didn't come from any one specific place. It came from the accumulation of everything that had happened that day that I hadn't planned. The captain, at the end, raised his glass and said, "To voyages that surprise us." Christina looked at me with that smile of hers. I raised my glass too. In Nassau, I came ashore alongside Christina as if we had always been that kind of pair. The kind that disappears for years and reappears as if there were no gap that needed explaining. We walked the streets under a sun that warmed without burning, stopped in front of shop windows without entering most of them, had lunch on a terrace overlooking the ocean where the fish was fresh and the conversation continued where it had left off on the ship, the way it does when two threads have enough length to survive any interruption. Christina told me about a new project for the agency, expanding routes through the Caribbean, including destinations she believes are being underestimated by the travel market. I talked about things I had set aside since Henry left, things that had stayed suspended without my deciding to suspend them. A photography course that had been on my list for 3 years, a trip to Yellowstone that I never would have planned alone, but that, sitting by the water in Nassau, suddenly seemed possible. Nothing was decided there, but it was named, and sometimes naming is what's missing. The thing was possible before, it just needed a voice to exist outside of your head. While we were sitting by the water, Christina looked at me differently, that look of someone who has gone far in their own thoughts and come back with something concrete. She said, "You know it's all going to be okay, right?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement, the kind you wait to hear without knowing you were waiting. I didn't say anything back. We sat looking at the ocean together, the two of us in silence, and that was enough. I didn't see Gregory in Nassau. I didn't look for him, and if he looked for me, I didn't know. We may have crossed paths in some corridor on the ship on the way back. I don't remember noticing. What I remember is that, on that return trip, the suitcase was in the same place, but I was in a different one. I can't explain that with more precision than that. When you're different, it's hard to name the exact point where you changed. When it was time to go back, Christina was firm. I would ride back with her to the city, there was no discussion. We went back up I-95 the same way we'd come, the same skyline, the same water. But it was different. The difference that isn't in the landscape, it's in who is looking at it. She dropped me off in front of my building with a long hug of the kind that lasts exactly the right amount of time. Not the time you give out of courtesy, nor the time that lingers because no one knows when to stop, but the exact time that hug needed to last. She promised she'd call more often, said she had been serious about Yellowstone. I laughed. I went inside. I waited for the elevator in the lobby with the new suitcase beside me, the suitcase I had bought thinking I deserved it, and which now had a reason for existing in a way I hadn't foreseen. I went up. I entered the apartment, turned on the living room light, set my bag on the bench by the entrance, took my shoes off before walking. These are the small rituals that organize you when you come back from somewhere large. I took a long shower. The water got hot, cooled, got hot again, and I stood under it for a time I didn't measure, letting the ocean leave my hair and skin. I lay down with my hair still slightly damp, looking up at the living room ceiling. My living room ceiling has a small stain near the window, close to the molding. Henry always meant to fix it, and never did. Time passed. The stain is still in the same place, and I don't mind anymore. I've come to treat it as part of that specific ceiling, as something that belongs to that room and that I don't have the heart to cover because it would mean covering one of the last things he left unfinished. I looked at it that night for a long time. I thought that Henry would have loved hearing this whole story. He would have stayed quiet, in that way he had of thinking before speaking, and then would have said something that was funny and right at the same time. He had that rare gift, the line that laughs and lands at once. That's when Gregory's voice message arrived. I looked at the notification for a full minute, phone in my hand, the apartment quiet around me. Not out of hesitation, out of choice. I wanted to be ready to listen, not just to react. I pressed play. He said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I know I did something wrong. Donna Angela decided to go at the last minute, and I didn't know how to handle it, so I handled it the way I did, and I know it was wrong." A pause. The trip was a disaster, by the way. She was seasick the whole time, spent almost all of it in the cabin. And I ended up fighting with Lauren over other things that had been building up. His voice had the quality of someone who had called after rehearsing, but with a real exhaustion beneath the rehearsal. It wasn't just guilt in the message, it was the weariness of someone who had spent days trying to balance things that don't balance without cost to anyone. I listened to the end. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment after the message finished, in no hurry to do anything. The apartment was quiet, with that specific silence of nighttime, denser than the silence of daytime, more honest, without the background sounds that fill the hours while people are still awake. My hand resting on the sheet. I picked up the phone. I opened a voice message to reply. I spoke with a calm I didn't have to work to find. It was there, it was present, it was mine. There's nothing to forgive. I only have one thing to say to you, son. Thank you. What a wonderful trip you gave me. I sent it. I put the phone on the side table, face up this time, and closed my eyes. The air conditioner made its usual soft sound, that white background noise I learned to hear after Henry left, and the apartment was without other sounds. At some point before sleep, the image came to me of the ship pulling away from the dock, enormous and white against the background blue, those lines that seemed to have no end, and of me on the gangway, suitcase in hand, without a plan and without any fear of not having one. Sometimes that's exactly how the good things arrive. Gregory responded a few days later, with a short message saying he was relieved, that he loved me, that whenever I wanted to talk about what had happened, he would be there. I didn't respond right away. I kept the message open, without hurrying to close it. Because some things need time to find the right words, not out of resentment, but out of clarity. And I have always preferred clarity to speed. The navy blue dress was washed carefully, folded the same way, and put back in the closet. But this time, with a different memory inside it, not of a dinner I had imagined with my son, but of a dinner I hadn't imagined, with the captain and with a friend of decades at a mezzanine overlooking the Atlantic. Life sometimes changes the story of what we keep inside things without asking permission. The dress is still the same. What was stored inside it is not. Christina called 2 weeks later. She asked if I had thought about Yellowstone. I said yes, I had thought about it. She said, then go. I wrote it down on the paper from the kitchen drawer, the same paper where I had written down the time of Gregory's cruise, the red gate, the care of repeating it out loud so as not to mix anything up. The paper is still there, with both things written on it. I haven't decided yet what to do with the irony of that, but Yellowstone is booked. If this story touched you, if it stayed with you in some way, share it. Sometimes we spend years waiting for the right invitation, the right gate, the son who will show up at the agreed-upon place. And what changes the course of an entire day is a hand on a shoulder, at the most unlikely moment, in the noisiest terminal. Take care of the people who show up in those moments. And take care of yourself too. Don't walk too quickly toward the exit before looking around one more time. If you'd like to hear more stories like this one, click on one appearing on your screen right now. Click and keep feeling with us.